Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I'm Adil Iskandar, an adjunct faculty member here. I teach courses on media and communications, and it's a real pleasure to have a speaker today, a notable speaker, and I'll be introducing him momentarily, whose work falls squarely within that area. Of course, the discussion surrounding the role of social media and activism in the Arab world and the extent to which online communities have pushed the envelope against authoritarian regimes that are very stagnant, very ossified, very rigid in their ways has drawn significant attention. There's a lot of talk, both within media scholarship and outside. It's a discussion that's happening in the public space as well, and it's a discussion that's extremely polarizing. There are those who are on one end of the spectrum that see this from sort of a technologically deterministic position, and there are those who are somewhat cynical and critical of the role of social media. Well, today we happen to have a speaker who can, identify what the characteristics of the social media are in the Arab world and how they inform the activism of the last year and so. So today's speaker is Jeffrey Ghanem. The topic of the presentation today is the Arab social media vortex, activism and cyber war for the dominant narrative. And just a brief introduction of Jeffrey. Jeffrey Ghanem is a media lawyer, veteran journalist, and development professional who received a Master's of Arts from Georgetown University here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in 1988, not too long ago.
I was 10 years old.
He has contributed widely to the analysis and debate about the rise of the social media and the Arab revolutions and protests for The Economist magazine, the magazine debates, if I may say so, the Washington Post, Chicago Public Radio, and Frost Over the World on Al Jazeera, that's hosted, of course, by Sir David Frost. He is the author of 2 reports for the National Endowment for Democracy's Center for International Media Assistance, CIMA, and those 2 reports are entitled let me start with the first one. Social media in the Arab world leading up to the uprisings of 2011. And the second is Digital Media in the Arab World 1 year after the revolutions. So he's been keeping a very close eye on what's happening in the social media in the Arab world over the past year, which I imagine makes you an incredibly busy individual. He served on the 2012 Freedom House Committee analyzing freedom of the press in the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, another organization that's getting a lot of press. Both in the Arab world and outside of it. Since 2001, he has served as a trainer and evaluator, as well as the Knight International Journalism Fellow in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Qatar. He instructed on the intersection of law and journalism at the Howard Marsh as a visiting professor in journalism at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. As a journalist, he was a staff writer and editor at the Detroit Free Press. He's also served as a legal affairs writer at the American Bar Association Journal in Chicago and was on the staff at the New York Times in Washington, D.C. He's also contributed to the Boston Globe from Detroit and Time Magazine in Cairo. In addition to his master's degree, he's also received a bachelor degree in journalism from Michigan State University and a JD from the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. So an incredibly, luminous experience, and one that we hope we can glean a lot from today. So without further ado, thank you, Jeffrey, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Idle, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and most appreciated. And it's a real treat, and it's a delight to be back at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, where I certainly spent some of the best days of my college career. Really, really great to be back. So thank you for the generous invitation to come back and visit. I'm going to go over a number of things today, and kind of fly through the PowerPoint. But this is a small group, and I'd like to create a dialogue as well, so that we can learn from each other and contribute to the analysis and the debate, which is ongoing and will, in my opinion, continue to evolve and morph into multiple directions as social media in the Arab world continues to develop. But let me set the stage. Let me set the context for the vortex. We all understand this is a very learned community here. Everybody is very much attuned to the Arab world and what's been going on. The Middle East is experiencing a profound media shift. That's putting it mildly. As Idle poignantly said, the ossified media controlled by the governments with media monopolies that are used as propaganda organs or to serve the interests of political leaders has changed. Now, I'm not a cyber utopian, nor am I an internet centrist, such that everything that we've seen over the past year plus will change the Arab world for the better. On the contrary, quite frankly, there's a lot that we need to be concerned about. And I think this perhaps demonstrates some of the power of the authorities throughout the Arab region. And this was almost emblematic of what existed prior to the uprisings and the revolutions. Yes, there was activism. Yes, there was a groundswell of really smart young people who were engaging online, creating a civil society in the virtual world that was more vibrant than what you saw on the streets of the Arab capitals throughout the region. And things changed, as we know, and they will continue to change. Just consider some of the numbers. I don't want to dwell on the numbers, but they're important contextually. They give us a sense of where we are and where we may be headed. Nobody really knows where we're headed, quite frankly. I think it's safe to say that things are changing so rapidly. Just a brief side note, to create the two reports that I hope you all read, and I hope you download from the ned.org //SEMA site. We're constantly evolving. I mean, these are rather academic, think tankish type papers, policy papers, to enable the media development community to get a better sense of what's going on in the Arab world, and they changed constantly, constant iterations, as you can imagine, late January 2011, early February, and again, this early spring, they morphed. So it's kind of difficult not to be in the newsroom anymore. I miss the newsroom. I spent, 15 years in the newsroom, you'd have multiple editions. A story would update, you'd send out an update, and you'd print the latest edition. Not any longer, unfortunately. Let's talk about the numbers. We're all familiar with the numbers here, but let me reiterate them anyway. 50% or more of the population in large population countries such as Egypt, Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Morocco are 25 years and younger. Elsewhere in the region, between 37 and 47%. Internet penetration is still very much for a minority of people throughout the Arab world, 358 million people across the region. Only about 105 million or so are connected online. And that's according to the International Telecommunication Union, according to the United Nations Development Program, Arab Knowledge Report out of 2009, about 60 million Arabic speakers in the region. Governments themselves, I am told, underestimate the numbers of people online. I'm not certain why. It requires a little bit more further inquiry. But again, I want to emphasize that it is a minority. And so we've heard a lot about the revolutions being Twitter revolutions, Facebook revolutions. I'm not an adherent of calling them such. In fact, I've come out in numerous fora to say that no, on the contrary, these are not Twitter, Facebook revolutions, and to even go into that analysis and debate, and I know it was touched upon in your fine symposium just a few weeks ago. We're not going to go there, but I just want to make that stand. I don't believe it. Facebook users stand at about 36 million, according to the Arab Social Media Report published by the Dubai School of Government. That 36 million grew from 21 million just 11 or 10 months earlier. Those aged 15 to 29 make up 70% of the users on Facebook. That's significant. Today, as we've known, a year plus out of the revolutions, we have tens of millions of people contributing to this vortex, as I call it. It's a whirling, swirling tornado of content, news, and information that picks up contributors just everywhere. And it's become a very vibrant environment. It's become, in my opinion, much more pluralistic, much more diverse for the Arab world. And really, again, quite a significant shift from the days prior to the revolution when state media monopolies controlled, by and large, what Arabs across the region received on a daily basis in their daily newspaper, on their government-sponsored television and radio shows, and other media, which are party affiliated. It's interesting to note that some of the microbloggers who've got wide followings, such as Sultan al-Qasimi, Wael al-Ghanim, Dr. Bassem Youssef, the cardiologist who has his own show on TV in Egypt, who was actually in Washington just last week. I saw him at the Arab American Institute banquet, and I tried to grab him for a brief interview. He said, no, I'm too busy, but then he still lingered and told me what he was very generous with his time. He said that there are far more copycats than we can even imagine copying his methodology, which is actually a real obvious riff on Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. Jon Stewart is, in fact, I'm told by Dr. Bassem Youssef himself, is actually helping him master the art of a live comedy show. And it may be the first live comedy show out of the Arab world. So something to watch, something to see on YouTube. But it's interesting that the comedians are taken very seriously. And it's just a way to get so much political commentary out in in cyberspace, in cafes. People are talking. Comedians are taken quite seriously. It's actually quite a significant, not necessarily new shift, because comedians are always sort of elevated to a certain stature. But with social media and the availability of dissemination, it's become something to watch. Digital media has enabled the blending of journalism, traditional media, citizen journalism, eyewitness accounts, media activism, that is to say, activists who are using media to elevate their cause to the level of news and information. Populist media is also ascendant. In Egypt in particular, we see numerous TV shows that are independently backed that focus on just populist issues. There's the cooking show, Sit al-Ghalia. There are numerous other programs that focus on bringing what's online to radio, to television. Interesting shows called Hashtag that discuss what's being talked about online. So it's that melding, that multi-platform approach, similar to Dr. Bassem Youssef's experience. A cardiologist became a comedian. He began online, then went to traditional media, a network, and now he explained he's being competed over. He's received maybe 4 or so offers to take his show to a number of other traditional outlets. So again, new media morphing into a traditional outlet, which is significant because we've also seen that in Tunisia, at Tunisia, which was an online news portal. Making news available in Arabic began online, and now it has a print edition. The editors of Tunisia were also implicated in a crackdown against a photograph recently published in the past month or 6 weeks or so, featuring a soccer star and his girlfriend, who was by and large pretty much undressed. And so, again, what's significant about that case is not the raciness of the photo, which is significant in and of itself, but the authorities are going after the editor of that publication. They're not shutting down the publication. They're going after the individual. And I think increasingly, and we're going to talk about this, we're going to see increased repercussions for the individuals behind the content as part of the battle for the predominant narrative. Governments, of course, are also using Facebook, Twitter, and traditional media to get their own narrative out. And we see that through the efforts of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces in Egypt, which has a Facebook page with 1.7 million plus likes. What do the likes mean? Hard to tell. Hard to tell. Is it slacktivism? Is it clicktivism? Is it anything else? What's significant about the Facebook page put out by the staff is that it's enabling tens of thousands of critical remarks to be seen publicly, transparently. That's what I think is significant. I mean, I can't recall ever before a ruling entity enabling people to criticize overtly, pointedly, really blatantly, and to feature that criticism in such a way as to enable it to be copied, retweeted, forwarded, contributed to further, and that is significant. So while they're competing to get their word out, competing for the predominant narrative, they're also enabling that engagement. They're in there, they're in the mix. So before the revolutions and uprisings, we saw a effort at blocking and filtering. Blocking and filtering will not disappear completely. They will not disappear. But in the digital age, it's more important to know what everybody else is saying. You want to be a part of the mix. You want to engage. If you're blocking, then no one's really going to have the ability unless they're going to use proxies or any number of other circumvention methods that the Middle East is very familiar with. The activists are familiar with, journalists, citizen journalists, and various communities. Interestingly enough, it appears to me that the Palestinian Authority recently blocked several online news sites which were believed to be in support of Mohammed Dahlan, a rival to the president, Mahmoud Abbas. So, you know, unfortunately, the Palestinians seem a little bit behind the curve on the social media revolution that has really breezed through the region. They're still going after the actual sites. Kind of passe, you know. You gotta get up to speed with the more modern authoritarian methodologies. You know, this is so pre-revolution. You know, and surprisingly, the Palestinians were really very much on the vanguard of activism and being out there, and their struggle, unfortunately, appears to have fallen behind. Arab governments continue to target journalists, bloggers, activists. It hasn't really stopped. There's an ebb and flow to it. Hard to pinpoint the number of activists imprisoned. Lots of good surveillance. I'm careful when I say surveillance. Lots of good activism that tracks the numbers of arrests. Global Voices is a terrific resource if you're interested. You know, but before the revolution in Egypt celebrated its first year around mid to late January, Field Marshal Tantawi released about 2,000 from prisons, including several bloggers and activists. So it is ongoing, in the degree to which blogging and activism are going to be subjected to the repercussions that we saw prior to the uprisings and revolutions, I think just remains to be seen. I don't think it's, we're at the point where people can say anything they want and do and contribute in ways without having some fear that their contributions may come back to haunt them and they may face some repercussions. The idea is to, my sense of it is to go after selective individuals to serve as a chilling effect, to continue to make people slightly fearful. You get the sense that you've got this freedom, you get the sense you can contribute, you've got easy internet access through the various ICT buildup in the years predating the uprisings and revolutions, and yet at the same time you've always got this sort of shadow looming overhead of facing possible repercussions, and serious ones at that. Social media is nonetheless reinvigorating print and traditional broadcast, and I think we have to keep in mind that satellite networks are really key. It's my sense that satellite networks are very key to the regional dissemination of online material that is locally generated. Let's keep in mind that, again, it's a minority of Arabs in the region who are online, maybe just over 100 million at the high end. Just an aside, Wael Ghanem in December 2010, just before Tunisia lit up, he was at a Google Days conference in Cairo or Jordan. there were 2 sessions of the Google Days conference, and he said that 100 million Arabs are expected online by 2050. I thought that was significant. And Adil, if you recall, we went to an event about a year ago at the World Bank where Wael Ghanim presented, you and I sat next to each other, and I asked him, I said, you said 100 million were expected online by 2015, and he said, if I recall correctly, he said, oh, that was an overestimate. Do you recall that? He said that was an overestimate. I can't quite figure out why he would think that that was an overestimate, because if you look at the numbers, if you look at the figures, it really seems like it's already been surpassed.
I actually read it to be differently.
Did you?
That he overestimated or overshot in terms of the time needed to reach that number. So 2015 is too far.
Okay, all right.
It should be happening soon.
Great, because it is.
Yeah.
Again, satellite networks are very much a part of this equation. They are contributing to the integration of the content that is being developed by the citizen journalists, by the activists, by the media activists, by the eyewitnesses, rebroadcasting it regionally, taking tips from Twitter, Facebook, other sites, rebroadcasting it regionally for the vast majority who are not online but who do have access to satellite technology. The number of likes, and we're going to look at some charts in just a few minutes, the number of likes on Facebook for satellite networks are in the millions. What does it mean? Is liking Al-Ahram or Yom Al-Sabi' or Al-Masri Al-Yawm something more than simply clicking? Is it slacktivism? Is it clicktivism? It's hard to tell. My sense of it is that by virtue of having that ability to follow, to like, enables you to receive that information, to judge for yourself what you're going to do with it, to have the opportunity to share it, to tweet it, to retweet it if it's coming in from other angles. That, in my humble opinion, is significant. That could possibly lead to greater and greater engagement. Hard to tell what the content is. Hard to tell where people are turning. Is it a certain subject, a certain topic, a certain news event? Pretty difficult. What's also significant is that if you took a look at the websites of a lot of traditional media, the websites didn't really enable people to contribute. Quite often the websites were broken. If you wanted to comment about a story, you weren't really able to. If you wanted to contribute to commentary, oftentimes it wasn't really possible. So by shifting that commentary and shifting that sharing over to commercial sites like Twitter and Facebook enables Arabs across the region to be able to partake in this exchange 24/7. 24/7. You know, we know the media is king during Ramadan, where the soap operas keep people up very late at night. This allows this kind of interchange throughout the year. I spoke to several satellite executives who say that social media is changing the way they operate. They need to be able to understand how to hashtag a story, how to edit video for Facebook, how to disseminate via Twitter. And further, social media is allowing them to use these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, others, as political cover. So that if a story is slightly sensitive, they can disseminate it online first, see if they're going to get some pushback from the authorities. And if they get pushback, they can always say, well, it's been online. It's already out there. And if they don't get any pushback, well, then that's also indicative of what they may possibly face. So the degree to which it's enabling more risk-taking, hard to tell precisely. However, it does enable that kind of sharing of information. Where are we going? What are some of the future issues that we will likely encounter? Greater numbers of Arabs across the region using social media platforms. We understand the numbers. Continued growth of online engagement and influencing of news and information channels. This is the activists, the media activists, the citizen journalists, the citizen eyewitnesses, ordinary people who want to contribute. Uncertain impact of the Islamist majority in Egypt, the moderate Islamist coalition majority in Tunisia, elsewhere. Uncertain the impact of Sharia law. How will it be interpreted? How will it impact free expression? Will the masses allow it? Something to watch. Increased cyber competition for the dominant narrative, and forgive me if I've overlooked it, but a big part of what we're here to talk about is the struggles of activists in environments such as Bahrain, where there is a cyber competition for the dominant narrative, where there's a competition for the most shared tweet, the most retweets of one's Twitter account. There are allegations that Syria is engaging in cyber warfare through the Syrian Electronic Army. It is credited with hacking into a Harvard website. It's credited with hacking into an Al Jazeera website because of Al Jazeera's reporting on the violence in Syria. There are reports of Twitter trolls, the counter-tweeters that are allegedly supported by Bahrain, such that if you criticize the governments of Syria or Bahrain or other Arab regimes, that you're going to get the Twitter trolls after you. The Twitter trolls will attempt to counteract your version of events or the global critics. That's significant. It is indeed significant. Syria fully understands the impact of social media. The news and information that we've received coming out of Syria over the past year has been enabled clearly through video uploading sites such as Bamboozer. Bamboozer was shut down earlier this year. Live video continued to sneak out of Syria, not very easily, but through, as Bamboozer called it on his website, alternate methods used to get the video out. But without that kind of coverage, news organizations were not easily let in. We know what happens to reporters such as the French journalist and photographer who were allegedly tracked by Syria using satellite technology. You could argue Anthony Shadid, of course, though his death was a physical ailment, he was nonetheless coming out of Syria in very, very tough circumstances. That puts the satellite networks in a position of having to trust online contributions. And then there is the issue of authentication. Where do major news organizations lie in the sense of, is what's being disseminated, is what's coming out of Syria, of other locations, authentic? Is it reliable? Is it truthful? The issues that a lot of major media are confronting are, how do we authenticate this material? That takes up a lot of resources, that takes up a lot of time, training of citizen journalists to deliver the authentic material that news organizations like Al Arabiya, like Al Jazeera are seeking, require a lot of training. And a few executives have said, our people are tired. We're tired of having to walk through a citizen journalist to teach them how to use a flip cam on the phone. It's hard work. So, it brings to mind the needs for training, for assistance. That's a whole other can of worms, you could say, because a lot of the training and donor-funded initiatives are often criticized as putting the activists, the media, development community in trouble, because they are trained to go out and do quite often risky things of covering these very serious violent activities, and then when they get in trouble, the donors are not often there to back them up. So that's a very much a sensitive topic, and we can always talk about that in our conversation as we begin to wrap up. Media law protections are certainly far from guaranteed, and many environments may become more constrained before they become more free. Again, content is the focal point. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Palestinian Authority, they've all gone after Facebook contributors and/or Twitter users for their content. It may sound silly, but again, go back to the Palestinian situation. 2 men were arrested, along with, I believe, a journalism lecturer for their role in Facebook updates that criticized President Abbas. Not clear what social good or what chilling effect that may have, but again, it's this going after the individual, going after the Twitter user. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what's ongoing. Let me talk about, again, the numbers. Hard to tell what they mean in the very big picture, but they do indicate a level of engagement, perhaps a baseline of engagement that we can continue to monitor as they grow, or don't grow, for that matter. Maybe they plateau at some point. But it's interesting that the Facebook likes are the light color, the Twitter followers are the darker. El Arabiya Arabic and Al Jazeera Arabic have got the most in the way of Facebook likes, just about 1.5 million for Al Arabiya and nearly 2 million for Al Jazeera. Those others indicated include Al Arabiya English, Al Jazeera English, BBC Arabic, MTV Lebanon, and On TV Egypt. Again, hard to tell. Is it clicktivism? Is it slacktivism? Like, sure, I'll follow MTV or I'll follow Al Jazeera English. Hard to tell. However, it is an entry point. And that entry point is important for students of the region, for media developers, for those who simply care. Similarly, selection of MENA region media outlets, Facebook likes and Twitter followers, for a number of daily print publications. What's interesting is that Al Masri Al Yom and Al Yom Al Sabah, 2 well-respected, independent, privately owned, maybe we shouldn't say independent, but privately owned newspapers, have got the most in the way of Facebook followers, Facebook likes. Al Haram actually doesn't do too badly when it comes to Twitter and Facebook. Al Shuruq also. Al Ra'i, Al Dastur, Al Ghad, Al Riyadh, Al Medina, Daily Star, Lebanon, not much out of Lebanon. Bandwidth is a problem in Lebanon. Al Nahar, Lebanon also, similarly. Al Quds Al Arabi, Palestine, not much there. The national UAE, not a lot. At Tunisia, kind of edging up there in Facebook. Gulf News at the very end, more Twitter than Facebook. It's interesting.
Excuse me.
Yes.
On which basis what are the criteria that they have decided, like Yom Saba and the Masri Yom have the top Twitters, or they are the top among others for having likes and Twitter. So do you have any idea what are the criteria? Is it like retweeting them a lot, or is it like influential?
Well, are you asking about the criteria for including them in this snapshot?
Yes.
It was just major media that I looked at out of the region. So why El Yom Saba and not some other newspaper?
Exactly.
I took a look at what were conveyed to me to be some of the more popular. I'm not certain if that answers your question.
Yeah, for example, like I could see a lot of Twitters by the An-Nahar, the Daily News for Lebanon, and almost every topic that I searched, there are lots by those have been, covered. So Twitter, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, mainly Twitter, not Facebook.
Okay.
So,
Are you talking about tweets or number of followers?
no, I'm talking
Is the
about.
follower, this is followers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's tweets.
So what I did was I took a look at each publication's Twitter page and Facebook page. And I basically, as of March 16th, I took the numbers, put them into an Excel spreadsheet, and the Excel spreadsheet came out with the graphs. So it's really paper, outlet by outlet, punching in the numbers,
Okay.
and then developing the graph therefrom. Yeah, that was the criteria, but the threshold criteria was simply popular media. You know, let's think of some of the more popular media in the region, and there were other outlets that actually you would think were popular, but didn't have much of a presence online.
So
They just,
Yeah.
they
it's
just
a
yes,
reflection of, like, so Al Rai and Understood.
Yeah.
Right? Not read by anybody but folks in Jordan.
yeah.
And Jordan's not that large, so it's just a reflection
Yeah.
of the access
Yeah.
in those countries?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, it's a reflection of, even within that microcosm,
Yeah.
how many are they getting? It's really hard to compare Al-Ahram with a Dastur in
Yes.
Jordan. I mean, very difficult. You know, 1 million circulation, Al-Ahram. I'm not certain what El Dastur's circulation is, but it's probably much, much smaller. It's not a relative indicator. It's simply an indicator of how many people are following at this moment in time. And I should note that at the start of the revolutions, and in the 2 months thereafter, I began tracking in January. After January, after the anniversaries were beginning to be celebrated, some media actually grew by 100,000 followers. I've got it in the report. I really encourage everybody to read the report. But it's really quite amazing how the followers were just clicking in droves. I guess that's the best way to characterize it. They were following in droves. What they were doing is, again, hard to tell. Were they tweeting? Were they retweeting? Were they sharing, commenting? Hard to tell. Similarly, here are some of the major satellite channels. CNN Global, which takes the lead in the number of Twitter, nearly 4 million. BBC World, Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Arabiya Arabic, CNN International, Al Arabiya English, and BBC Arabic. BBC Arabic, perhaps 100,000 plus or so. Similarly to Al Arabiya English, 100,000 plus. Al Jazeera Arabic actually had fairly sizable following. Now, I should also point out that a number of the satellite networks have got multiple pages. These were the formal pages, the official pages that I tracked for each outlet. Sometimes there are pages on Twitter or Facebook that are devoted to a particular section at the network. I did not track those. So you could actually, boost the numbers of the Arabic satellite networks to some degree. But I think by and large, again, it's simply a tracking. It's simply a comparison. Where are we going? Where are we going? Is the social media vortex something to be feared? Is it something that will overtake? Is it something that we should continue to contribute to? By all means, yes. It's really quite significant that so much change has occurred in actually so little time. There was definitely a buildup for the decade prior to the uprisings and revolutions, insofar as the ICT infrastructure, the broadband, the fiber optic to the home. The Gulf countries really invested a lot in the ICT infrastructures, other countries as well. Places like Lebanon, which lacks bandwidth, which suffers from low bandwidth, could easily be remedied, but perhaps it's been said to me it's not a government priority. I'm interested in carrying forward this dialogue to you, open to questions, open to continuing the analysis and the debate. So thank you very much. Any questions?
First, is it a stick figure, a sovereign, or a subject?
It's tough to figure out who's running at any given time. It could be a sovereign. It could be the subject.
Okay, we're gonna take questions.
It should be, it's not as often.
All right. Hello, hello. It's on, but it's not on. Okay. All right. So we have a fair amount of time for questions. I have more questions than I can actually probably pose without domineering. So so why don't we open it up? And I think we have a good maybe 30 minutes or so, 20 to 30 minutes. Yeah. So we can't pass the mic around, but over there. Yes.
I'm just curious to know, since Islamist movements have been on the rise in many of the Arab countries, especially Egypt and Tunisia, I was wondering if you had the chance to observe their online activities and if they are using this tool to reach more people in Egypt and Tunisia and to get more popularity, since I know that the Ikhwan, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because of their very vague political situations, are losing some of their popularity. And I know they are very good users of social media in a way. What's your impression about this?
You know, I quite frankly have not been tracking to any degree that I could comment on the Islamist movement and their use of social media. But I do know that in the case of Tunisia, they're quite active at engaging writers, journalists, and bloggers for what those writers, journalists, and bloggers are communicating about. One of the points of reference in the report I drafted was that popular blogger Lina Ben-Mehni has been attacked by Salafist activists for her writing about religion. There is the case of Persepolis and Nesma TV that has come under criticism because of the airing of the Franco-Iranian film Persepolis, because it said to portray an image of God. And the owner of Nesma TV is facing legal repercussions. The courts just a day or so ago have adjourned the case, and a verdict is anticipated. So that, to me, had been characterized by Tunisian media observer in Tunis as more than a statement about Nesma TV. It's really a statement about Tunisian freedom of expression. It's much larger. And that is to say, the case of Tunisia is really quite significant because there are no red lines right now. And it's become something of a free-for-all to the point where actually people like some measure of limitation as to what can be said. There's been a lot of incitement to violence. There have been lots of, unethical, professionally unethical activities. Several journalists have been put in harm's way or implicated with potential death threats. How seriously do you take it? Well, hope it never comes to pass, those threats. But that's what we've been seeing. And so while I haven't quite tracked with any authority the Islamist movement online, they are nonetheless active.
Jeff,
Yes.
if I may
Yes.
add something
Yes, of
on
course.
this point. One of the problems that most of the research on this area tends to suffer from are certain blind spots. And it's a blind spot that's a result of not being able to sort of see what a lot of the, for lack of a better description, Islamist movements have been doing online. Many of them were not using Facebook the same way. They were not using Twitter the same way. They weren't popularizing their messages, so they were operating primarily in discussion forums until the revolutions. So for instance, you saw a massive influx of Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood followers onto Facebook. And they have their own platforms in more ways than one that are now starting to kind of come onto the picture. And the same applies to satellite. So when we look at satellite TV, the graph that you did was really fantastic. But I think it's important to plug in some of those other networks. So now there's a NES, primarily Salafi station in Egypt that has remarkable popularity and is growing significantly online. Also at Hikma, a significant following. So, and the same applies to Facebook. So now most of these followers have switched platforms to the platforms that we're accustomed to looking at, and the game has changed in more ways than one. So I think it'll take a little bit of time, maybe more. Another year's worth of research from Jeffrey.
And you.
2 years post
And you do it.
Can't throw it on my plate.
Please. Yes.
Can I comment on that question?
Yes.
My name is Alia. I'm an Egyptian. I'm from Egypt. I'm only here for a month. But regarding the Muslim Brotherhood's activities online for the past year and a half, it hasn't been quite effective. They don't really, because we have 1 million Egyptian people online on Facebook and Twitter in Egypt, approximately. But at the same time, we're 86 million, and all they care about right now is the votes. And actually, they're working harder on the ground with the people who don't have access to the internet. So they're monitoring the activities online, but they're not participating very much, and they don't have like major activities online. But their online website, the Muslim Brotherhood website, is not accessible to a lot of people. A lot of people don't have a knowledge of the website. So I think that they're not doing a very good job. Like, they're not very active online right now. They don't really care. They prioritize their priorities, and the priority right now is getting the votes on the ground with the people who have the majority of the votes in Egypt are not online. They're not active online. So, but that's my personal opinion.
I think the number of Facebook users in Egypt is actually over 10 million right now.
Oh.
At least according to the Arab Social Media Report published earlier this year. I think it is. Because it was about 6 million last year. And I think it's increased considerably. Egypt has actually experienced the most dramatic increase in Facebook usage.
And actually, I wanted to comment on what you said, that this isn't a Facebook revolution.
Right, right.
The Facebook and Twitter started, it was the start, but it wasn't, I agree with you, it wasn't a Facebook revolution, because actually the internet was cut off for a week, the first week of the revolution, and yet the revolution continued, and it started after 3 or 4 days of cutting off the internet. So. True.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic. Thank you, though. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes. You talked a little bit about the concept of blocking versus working against the content, and even a little bit about sort of targeting individuals. One of the ways I've been thinking about looking at Syria and how the Assad regime has been using access to the internet is the whole intelligence prospect of jamming versus collection. Sort of you jam sometimes, but you don't want to talk. Other times you collect against them. I don't know who they are, what they're talking about.
Right.
My interest and my question has to do with the mechanics of that, and how much of it is capability and how much of it is intent, in the sense of how much is the Syrian regime just not capable of controlling networks, and how much of it are they deliberately allowing discussion so that they can target activists?
That's a good question. I couldn't respond to the technicalities. I wish I could. Would anybody else like to tackle that one? Something, the kinds of issues that we're confronting are, very new and really require the hardcore research that you can do as a student of this subject matter. It's still very. It's still very early.
Yeah.
Is it not extremely early in this process, such that there's so much to gather, so much to really grasp? Yes.
We're still trying to understand the infrastructure, and this is part of the problem, and how regimes decide to use infrastructure to be able to follow and surveil. For instance, we discovered recently that the Egyptian regime had done a remarkable job in monitoring and collecting information through Skype, and we thought Skype was impenetrable. And instead, they had hours and hours of
They think it is too.
So I think we're still trying to figure out what the Syrian regime is doing and for what reason, and at what point it decides to strike.
And there's two sides of this capability too. There's the actual capability to control the networks themselves, and there's the capability of the activists themselves to use proxy servers and satellites and actually get around the infrastructure constraints.
What they're trying to do in Syria is to basically follow what the Chinese are doing, which is to essentially turn the Syrian cyberspace into an intranet. so that it's completely blockaded, and that way, even the proxies can't help. Without a satellite, you can't really do much. But that'll take a significant amount of time and a lot of resources to be able to.
Which is not the right time.
Which is not the right time.
Osama, you had a question?
My next?
Yes, go right ahead.
Well, I want to thank you, Jeff.
My pleasure.
Quite very clear, but I want to take you back to the idea of the master narrative, and maybe try to understand what you mean by that. And my question, I guess, the short of it is, what kind of traction does social media provide for the master narrative? I mean, if you look at ideas of public sphere as an indicator of civil liberty, of a discriminating public opinion, print journalism is one aspect of it. There's other geographic landmarks that are sort of representative of this public sphere. You could have trade unions, labor associations, political parties. So are we now to add social media as one more area, and then where do you locate it geographically? Because I understand all of these different indicators have, it's part of their activity that they actually occupy visible space, right? And you can see how the contestation over Tahrir Square, for example, is part of creating a geographic as well as a virtual public sphere for this master narrative that you're talking about. So again, how does social media either contribute, or is it sort of is this the weakness of social media? That in fact, it doesn't necessarily provide a rational, or at least a geographically locatable or accessible point for a master narrative to take root?
It could be seen as a weakness. It could also be seen as a strength. My sense of it is that, prior to the development of the ability to communicate, just writ large, by civil society, by journalists, citizen journalists, eyewitness accounts, you had a master narrative that was typically available at the corner of every major capital throughout the Arab world, and that was the propaganda state monopoly newspaper, or it was the radio show, or it was the television show. So there has always been a master narrative from the government's perspective. But it didn't necessarily allow the masses to communicate in ways that they are now able to communicate and criticize and think critically and share news and information, and create that alternate master narrative or alternate to the official narrative, whatever it may be. The idea that it's not geographically fixed is, again, I think, it's the strong suit. It's constantly in flux. It's constantly changing. It's not something that you could actually identify fully. And it's a tool, after all. It's a tool. The engagement of that tool is what's enabled people to take part, to compete. It's a competition for the predominant narrative, and it's going to change from time to time. I mean, we saw it in Egypt. According to news reports earlier this year, the SCAF was able to turn public opinion against the April 6th youth movement. And in part, it was because the SCAF was becoming savvier at getting their version of events, that blaming the youth activists for the economic doldrums, for lack of jobs, for traffic jams, or the constant tie-ups and hassles that people are confronting. That's the ability to be able to compete in that sphere. It's my sense that it's a good thing, that it's not similar to a union or an association, that it's more of a tool. Yes, go right ahead, in the back.
Can I go back to your question about government, these regimes blocking access? And you mentioned there's kind of been a shift away from these regimes blocking sites and more focus now on targeting individuals, editors, individual accounts. But you also mentioned recently that the PA blocked a series of sites in lieu of political opposition. And last year, when Mubarak shut down internet, I mean, that was kind of the extreme of blocking access. So in your opinion, what's the trajectory of just blocking internet access, blocking these sites? Are we moving away from that? Are we developing norms of targeting individuals as opposed to just severing access?
It's my sense, yes. I don't think blocking, filtering, and controlling access is going to completely disappear. I think it'll be used opportunistically. But I get the sense that everybody wants access. Lots of ministers throughout the Arab world are now using Twitter. They had been even prior to the uprisings, particularly in Jordan. I got the sense from research in middle of 2010 that the Jordanians were just all over the social media scene. And I think it began under King Hussein. Actually, he was one of the first Arab leaders to actually have a very vibrant website. Back in the 90s. It was really quite significant, and King Hussein was actually credited with being among the first to do so. And so I think that everybody wants access. The ruling regime wants access, the opposition wants access, Islamists want access. So, to the degree that they are in power, I don't think that they're going to limit that ability to communicate and to get out there. And I think regimes also still want to keep track. And again, it's opportunistic. There may be times when they're going to use it in a way is to shut them down, send a chilling effect, send a strong message. But by and large, I think governments typically would want to know what is being said, to monitor it that way and to counteract it on the content level. That's my sense. Yes, I'm sorry. There have been questions up here.
You do the pointing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Oh,
You had a question.
That's all right, and I hope I'm not beating it at a horse here, but I actually have focused on in my research on China, so I'm very interested in this whole issue, turning away from blocking and trying to gather intelligence and counteract and pulling out individuals. My question is actually about about the mechanics, but more about just sort of the financial backing and the manpower to do this kind of filtering, and I'm also wondering if it has anything to do with linguistic barriers. So, except for, there are other countries besides China where Chinese is spoken, but by and large, you're talking about China, whereas in the Arab world, I wonder if, because each individual country is smaller, and because you have a cross-border language, if that has, those two factors have anything to do with the failure, if you may, blocking and filtering.
Well, there is no China-like firewall in the Arab world. There was nothing architecturally structured when the ICT infrastructures were created to equate with China's attempts. There were localized attempts, and I think Ida can also speak to that as well. But insofar as your question, can you just remind me, you're asking in particular?
Oh, well, I'm afraid of probably asking too many questions at once. I guess I'm wondering about the factors as to why blocking just hasn't worked out in the Arab world. And I'm wondering if some of the factors might include that each individual country doesn't have the means or the manpower, unlike an enormous place like China, or if there might also be a linguistic factor that's cross-border.
I think it could speak to means, although Tunisia's enterprise was really quite vast even before the revolution. Egypt had a very large bureaucracy monitoring Facebook, but I think the masses were just able to overwhelm the structure. I think quite simply put that the ability to circumvent, the ability to use proxies, the ability to get out and over, and there were blocking, and there was proxies that went over the blocks, and then there was over blocking. It was that typical cat and mouse game as it's been described so often. Whether it was linguistic, whether it was a lack of coordination among the various countries in the Arab world to have a concerted effort to block. They all have their own issues, so they all would probably want to block for various different reasons. Different levels of liberalism, different levels of tolerance for certain types of content throughout the region. But again, structurally, architecturally, it never really arose that way. And I think they've recognized that it is futile. By and large, they've recognized that it is futile.
If I may add to Jeffrey's comments, I think one of the sort of characteristics of the online spaces in the Arab world is the fact that they emerged primarily for governments to tap into so that they can sort of translate their messages out, but more so for potential profiteering on the part of the market. So it was extremely quick for the Arab sort of online spaces, specifically internet sort of sales and what have you, advertising. They monetize really quickly. A great example of that is actually Jordan and Egypt, as well as Morocco. And given that there was significant pressure for them to be able to tap into and access markets outside of their national boundaries. So, for instance, if you were, of course, it's purely hypothetical. If you were, a Libyan-based internet company and you were selling products of some sort, or selling, ideas or knowledge in some capacity, your largest market is actually across the border in Egypt. So, in that sense, it was disadvantageous for most governments to restrain and constrain access, which is part of the reason why Saudi Arabia is the closest that any Arab government sort of media infrastructure comes close to the Chinese model, where the market is actually internal, and so they do a far better job blockading anything, either on the grounds of decency or political sort of violation, because there's no sort of economic incentive to go outside. So that's an additional dimension. Keep in mind.
Certainly. Questions? Yes.
You have talked about social media. I know that you don't agree that Egypt was a Facebook or Twitter revolution, but I think that the strength of the social media in the Arab Spring has been its global participation. So there are a lot of expatriates outside of these countries that have supported the revolutions and supported the people in them. There's a measure of, just psychological support, and then they've propagated the videos, the tweets, the whatever. So I wonder if you can speak to, do you have any information about anyone who has studied the kind of international impact of particularly expatriates who are living abroad to these revolutions? As an example, I know that the February 16th movement, there was a false Facebook page put up. So there's some of that. The government realizes there's an international component to this and is actually trying to do something deceptive.
That is a very serious and worthy topic of further research. One issue regarding the expatriate community came up with respect to those following Arab media. And while it wasn't, I didn't drill down so far as to begin to identify whether it is the expatriate community that is following online, Facebook, Twitter. Anecdotally, there's a sense that the expatriate community is actually quite significant in following of Arabic language media. Hard to prove as yet, but in response to your question directly, hard for me to really address the expatriate contributions. I know it's been involved in Libya and elsewhere, but really hard for me to address it fully. If anybody else has any contributions on that one, I would welcome them.
I think we have time for one more question.
Gentleman in the back, you've had your hand up, and then the gentleman up front.
Well, I'm wondering, actually, we hear a lot of talk about Twitter and Facebook and social media as being a method of unifying many different voices within political parties. But recently, with the refusal of the February 14th coalition in Bahrain to really push forward a formal political party and whatnot, and sort of dividing into different camps with like the Sanibas youth and the Piazza youth and whatnot. I'm wondering to what extent you might foresee Twitter or online forums as being something which creates more fractures and cripples the political process as it's been established as the formation of formal political parties and engagement in the public sphere.
That could happen. I think what is the result of the increased engagement that we see has yet to be borne out. And it's hard to tell what will happen, but I think you raise a plausible scenario of the crippling. Or is it not only just the crippling, but are people going to be using increased access to, as they did after the fall of the Soviet Union and the democracy development in Eastern Europe, to go online to shop? What will be the ultimate usages of the increased engagement? And it, again, early on in the analysis, early on in the research, hard for me to tell, but I think it's a good point. Yes.
Just a short note. Last week I attended a seminar on Iranian version of the same social media, and the two people who were responsible for living in Iran, or one expatriates in England, essentially reflected the same thing. There's a very sophisticated opposition, and there's a template that's used by both the government and the opposition forces, where they'll take an ounce of truth about an opposition person or group and lace that with a pound of lies that they would like to propagate in order to discredit the opposition. So it's a double-edged sword, that social media can easily be corrupted because it's hard to validate. And the people were speaking from the Ninian Forum said that the best protection against that is to establish as many blogs as you can and consistently put out the same position, so that you have other ways of protecting yourself and validating your position across many sources. So as it develops, it seems to have many opportunities to be undermined.
There was another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Two questions.
So near the end of your presentation, you were saying kind of like what's next, okay, the picture of the tornado, and you said something. Is it something that we should continue to contribute to? Absolutely, right? So there's something about social media and kind of the internet writ large, which has this kind of decentralizing presence on the one hand, where it's almost like a socialization of this market of information. At the same time, though, there's something very scarily centralized about social media. It seems to me that when social media and the internet has been useful in expanding civil society, it's precisely when online activity is paired with subversive on-the-ground action. So when you're talking about it's something that we should continue to contribute to, well, I mean, you look at something like Facebook, where maybe they were helping to kind of disseminate tactics. Maybe Twitter opened up like a call-in line when the internet was blocked off. At the same time, Facebook has been complicit in shutting down websites in China and Israel that are specifically geared to silence the opposition. So when you're talking about contributions, I'm a little bit fuzzy on the idea of what that means. Are we then saying it's okay to kind of from an outside perspective be subversive and subversive in particular markets and not others? And then where do we stand on issues like these kind of groups that are even more subversive and considered universally illegal, like anonymous or something like that? I mean, there seems to be no kind of general framework for this except for what may be in our interests or in our control at a given moment, and then when it starts to become out of our control, it's very easy to turn around and say, oh no, it's okay, like Twitter, you can put a line out to the Egyptian protesters, but the Chinese aren't so welcome.
You raise a really valid ethical and moral question that I think everybody who participates in the social media sphere needs to consider with respect to their own contributions. My statement that yes, we should continue to be a part of it is, I guess, perhaps a little overly rhetorical. Absolutely contribute according to your own sense of your contribution. You don't necessarily have to contribute to Facebook or Twitter. You can write, you can blog, you can do any number of things to contribute in your own ways that speak to your own beliefs, your own political positions. The moral, ethical issues writ large are serious. They're very serious, and they permeate the discussion when you drill deep and when you consider the serious issues of corporate sponsorship, when you consider the issues of donor support to certain groups that, again, as I mentioned in my talk, get certain individuals in trouble and don't necessarily support them when they're incarcerated. There are lots of serious issues that need to be worked through, but it's up to the individual to really decide for themselves. But you raise a lot of really interesting points, and these are points that we're going to have to begin to wrestle with, ultimately.
Just a quick follow-up
Yes,
to what
yes.
you said. So he was sort of problematizing the issue of what contribution means. If I may get you to problematize the we aspect, largely because to a large extent, in almost every circumstance where the we is the sort of U.S. government or any agency that receives funding from the U.S. government ends up finding itself somewhat incriminated whenever it supports certain initiatives. Take, for instance, someone like Oued. There's a lot of negative press about Oued in Egypt because of a certain training session that he may have attended, someone that he may have been in touch with. I mean, any potential identification of a connection to U.S. funding ends up incriminating the process, and in some cases, dismissing it entirely, at least rhetorically speaking, in an environment where people are actively engaging in these conversations. So, where is the we in all of this, and to what extent is this sort of translating into policy in more ways than one? We know that it's an outright policy when it comes to Syria. And there's open support for Syrian activists and cyber dissidents, and many of them sort of travel to the U.S. and receive funding and support and internships and fellowships and what have you. But to what extent is this backfiring, and to what extent is it giving more ammunition to the regime to be able to target and continue sort of subverting these narratives?
Those are all really good points. I mean, I agree with you. It's hard to argue with you when I agree. I understand it. I understand the politicization of social media and our foreign policy objectives vis-a-vis a free internet are not clearly something that we all love to boast about. But I really hope I'm not avoiding your questions in any respect. I'm just trying to get to the point where I can say, yeah, these are major problems. These are just major, serious issues that we as the thinkers and the thought leaders on these subjects, and the writers and the bloggers need to begin to develop the understanding so that we help others begin to kind of put a framework around something that is actually quite amorphous and quite abstract and changing day by day. Foreign policy related to support for internet activists runs the gamut. You may see it out of Syria, but you don't necessarily see it out of Gaza. Where were we prior to the uprisings and revolutions when so many activists were getting in trouble, facing serious repercussions, torture, and continue to do so? So it's definitely something that is not as goodness and blue skies all the time. This is serious. It's serious politics, and it is major. Yes, there are two questions. The young lady behind the man in the sweater.
Actually, just sort of to build on that intersection of U.S. or Western foreign policy and social media activism, I think with Bahrain in particular, that competition for the dominant narrative is really interesting to contextualize in terms of international intervention and or lack thereof. But that I was just wondering if you had looked at the idea of coalition building and information sharing, not just within a community, as in the February 14th coalition in Bahrain, for example, but also with external humanitarian partners, for example, and just the influence that that sort of competition for the dominant narrative has on humanitarian intervention. Because I mean, you're seeing groups entering Bahrain either with or without permission, and you know, doing these interviews, doing these sort of like attempts at helping the doctors or whatever it is, that just simply would not have been possible. They may not have even known that they were needed before social media, before these videos could be put up on YouTube. So it's not even necessarily an issue of whether or not these groups want to intervene or are capable of, which is typically how we conceptualize a humanitarian intervention, is simply can we do it, but an issue of do they know they need to do it. And so I didn't know if that had come up in your research at all.
It had not, but it's very insightful, and it's definitely something I would encourage you to continue to develop and publish.
I'll keep writing the paper then.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's very insightful. Yes.
I just wanted to draw a little bit more on the who is the we. I was in Jordan in the fall, and I realized the internet was really expensive. And I started thinking, you know, who are the contributors to the discourse on the internet in Jordan? And that's true across the board. I mean, in general, internet penetration is pretty low in the Arab world, relatively speaking. So who are the people that we're talking about here? It's not the same as in the United States, where penetration is really high. There's definitely a populist discourse. We can speak of that. In the Arab world, I think it's, you know, we can't really talk like that. I mean, the people who have access and who are really contributing seem to be the elite. And at this point in time. So I'm just wondering how we're dealing with that and what we're talking about when we're drawing political conclusions based on social media discourses.
The issue of the elite dominating the discourse, perhaps? Is that what you were pointing to? And access? It's definitely an issue. Yeah. 3G, 4G technologies in Jordan are very expensive. One of the senior leaders of Ramram, one of the major sites in Jordan that is actually quite innovative and very much on the cutting edge, was complaining about the lack of that capacity to be able to engage youth because 3G and 4G are too expensive for the youth centers, where many of them actually go online and can't get the enabled phones to be able to partake. So those are issues. There is, of course, the digital divide. There are the issues of, you know, again, it's only a minority, and even within those numbers, it is probably a subset of elites who are communicating and engaging, who have that ability. Those are ongoing issues that need to be reckoned with.
Maybe the
So.
Saudi Arabians haven't had a full revolution yet.
Interestingly enough, when King Abdullah was getting rid of certain ministers early in 2011, many of them said their goodbyes on Twitter. So thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure. My pleasure. Great to be back. Very insightful questions. You guys have great research topics. Go out and report, publish, tweet, get them out there. You've all got really interesting topics of further research. So thank you very much. Quite an eye-opener for me. Thank you.